Hi, and welcome to this first installment of Interview with a Researcher. I'm here today with my colleague and good friend, Amanda Wray, and Amanda is going to be talking with us about her oral history research work and hopefully about some of her perspectives more generally as well. So I'm going to go ahead and read a bio about Amanda, and then I have a set of questions that I'm going to ask Amanda, so we can make this sort of like a conversation and hopefully get to some of the really interesting and helpful parts about how to conduct oral histories and what they're good for and why they're so important. So thanks for being here. So Amanda Wray is Associate Professor of English at UNC Asheville, and she also teaches gender and sexuality studies. In January 2019, Dr. Wray partnered with Blue Ridge Pride and UNC Asheville internship students to begin collecting oral histories from LGBTQ plus communities in Western North Carolina. To date, they've secured over 60 interviews and 20 plus boxes of physical artifact materials. You can check out the archive on Instagram at WNC_LGBTQIA, where you can link to their archive and their YouTube channel as well. So I'm really pleased you're here. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So before we get to oral histories, could you please share a little bit about you and your research interests, as well as your general approach to research?
My general approach to research feels pretty messy usually. I think this is probably why I like oral history so much, because I get to go into my research and to go into meeting people with an open mind and an open heart. With oral histories, you don't have an agenda. There's not a hypothesis I'm trying to prove or anything like that. My job is simply to listen. And I love getting to hear people's private stories. I really love intergenerational conversation, which is a crucial aspect to oral history. I just think that people's lives are really interesting, and we're all so different, and we have a lot to learn from one another. And I constantly am in an oral history feeling like, wow, like you just can't believe this stuff of people's lives, really. As Dr. Batada said, my current research is with the LGBT archive. Tomorrow, actually, I'm doing a walking tour of West Asheville with 3 of the children of original business owners in West Asheville back in the day when there wasn't a bridge and it was just a ferry. And so Asheville and West Asheville were totally different municipalities. But mostly I'm working with the LGBT archive, and yeah.
That's great. Wow, that's really interesting. And I really appreciate your setting your approach up in contrast to or just alongside of the more quantitative hypothesis-driven research. Yeah, I think that's really important for us to keep that in mind too. Wonderful. So would you tell us, to you, what is oral history?
Oral history, I'm a feminist, and so I consider oral history a feminist methodology because it aims to break down some hierarchies with what counts as history. Oral history is often called the people's history. Alessandro Portelli is an Italian scholar who does American studies, and this is a quote from him. He says, "Oral history aims to provide evidence for new directions." And so oral history really prioritizes marginalized voices. Oral history aims to offer counter stories to what we consider the dominant narrative of history, right? It's the winners who get to write the books, right? When we think of it in terms of colonistic terms. And so oral history is really about the people's history. It's about building relationships with people. I interview people multiple times, sometimes over the course of months or years. Oral history came out of the labor rights movement originally in this as a strategy to help unionize workers, especially individuals who at this time, weren't perhaps literate. Many of them were immigrants, things like that, to try to help them tell their story about their working conditions in an effort for lobbying for labor rights. And so in academia, it was kind of like this bastardized research, right? Considered not very rigorous, because you couldn't synthesize data, because there was no hypothesis you were proving. And so you can read things, in the 60s in academia that's really calling oral history not rigorous. But feminists, social scientists really recognize the value of storytelling, and the role storytelling plays in making social change. And you can't really simplify reality, right? And oral history helps us to like embrace the complexities of life, and of memory, right? So you may remember a story one way and at this point in your life, and then 20 years from now, it has a different meaning for you, right? And so you'll tell it differently 20 years from now than you might today. So that's how I kind of define oral history, the people's history.
That's terrific. And it really also speaks to, thank you for sharing that sort of historic and kind of contextual origins, and the feminist and other sort of theoretical foundations as well, because in public health research, I think we do have some sense of place and some sense of community oriented work, but we really adhere to that traditional research approach of like coming with a question, whereas the foundations you're talking about really comes from a place of advocacy, of wanting to tell the story for some good to come from it. Yeah.
And you don't even know what's going to come from it, right? I might record an oral history now that's interesting to me for, these 5 reasons. But when I put it online and it lives there forever, right? It gets to keep, it becomes a source of information for anybody, for whatever kind of, that they're looking for. Everybody's going to look at it and take something different away from it, I guess I mean to say.
Yeah, that's amazing, because yes, you can go back to it, and depending on the time when you're listening to it or reading it or whatever, watching it, it can tell you a different, the story is different too in some ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Love it. Well, that gets to my next question, and actually I think you've answered this to some degree, but is there anything else you would want to say about why you conduct oral histories?
I think it's fun. I really do like listening to people's stories. I just, oral history is something that came into my life when I was in graduate school, in terms of it having a name, but I grew up as a child just getting to like listen and learn. I grew up in a very oral tradition in my house, small town Kentucky. I was born and raised in one house that my parents, are in the process of selling this year, because my father just passed away. But my mom and my dad, both of them also grew up on land and in small homes where they were born and raised, and their parents died in those houses. And so like, we just have this, like, there was just always somebody sitting on the front porch with some kind of food and some kind of story happening. And it just feels like, when I went to college and one of my professors was like, "Oh, that's oral history. Have you ever thought about studying folklore?" And I was like, "What? Like, there's a whole discipline for Sunday brunch?" Like,
oh, that's great. It's like, it's in you. Yeah. And this is natural, right? As opposed to some other methods that might be used. Yeah. So can you tell us about how you conduct oral histories? If you could maybe explain the major steps that you undertake in preparing and collecting and analyzing and disseminating. How does this take shape?
Well, you start with consent. Consent's always the first thing. You know, people own their own story. So at any point they can decide they want to withdraw their story from the archive. And they have the right to do that. In the LGBT archive, we all share the same consent forms. You know, I'm managing a volunteer pool right now of about 32 people who are out doing interviews and things for the archive, or helping us with various behind the scenes parts. But to do an oral history interview, you start with consent. You have a bank of questions. So in a 2-hour interview, you might ask 5 questions. You might only ask 2. So we have like a 1.5 pages of questions, a bank of questions, but I have highlighted on there just like 3 or 4 that we always try to answer. In one of the 2 interviews, we try to do 2 interviews with our participants. So you have some questions, you get your consent forms. Usually interviews do take about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. I've done interviews before that went on a little longer than that, but they were in person. So this was back in the day when I got to like make tea and have, you know, cake with my participants. You know, I'm a bread maker, so I often bake bread for people. And stuff like that. It's so much nicer when you can go to somebody's house, you know, get to look at their fridge, see what their magnets look like. You know, all those things become clues in building a relationship with the person that you're interviewing. It's people are really willing to tell you a story about a picture that they would perhaps not have thought of if you're like, tell me your story, you know. I generally start an oral history by asking people, what's something you want to make sure we get to? Let's start there. I don't do oral histories chronological. Tell me where you were born and what your childhood was like and move through someone's life. We just don't think that way either. I think memory is so associative. And so I like to start with asking them, what do you want to tell us? Or what is your something about your story that you really want to share? And you'd be surprised, most people have something. Some people are like, oh, you know, I can't even believe you want to interview me, you know, and then they talk for 2 hours and have all of these amazing stories, and it's wild. So after the interview, you know, during the interview, your job is just to listen. You might pose a couple of questions. You're maybe following up on some details to ask how to spell something maybe, but mostly you're just listening and letting their story play out the way they want it to. Then you transcribe it, which takes forever. And we're really fortunate with the archive that Blue Ridge Pride set up a grant for us. And so people in the community just give us money to pay just for the transcriptions, which is huge. So after I do the transcription, I send it back to the interviewee, let them read it. Maybe they might change things that are spelled wrong or words we got incorrect. It doesn't often happen, but it does sometimes that somebody wants to pull something out of their interview. I also, as the lead researcher, make an executive choice about that in many cases, where somebody will tell a story about somebody in high school and they'll name their name, and I just pull their name out because we don't know if that person was out then or is out now. And so just to, as much as possible, protect the safety and privacy of people. So then once the interviewee's like, yep, that's ready, then we at UNCA put our interviews on the oral history metadata synchronizer. It's some free technology out of the University of Kentucky, and it makes all of our typed transcriptions. It links the typed transcription with the audio so that you can hear someone tell their own story, but you can skip around in the interview with keyword searches and stuff like that.
That's great.
And then hopefully someday, I'm doing this a little bit now here and there, you publish on it, or you try to amplify that voice somehow by doing a social media post. I just wrote an article, for example, for the Journal of Appalachian Studies talking about Holly Boswell, who moved, can I tell you about Holly Boswell? Just a little?
Please, yeah, I love it.
Holly Boswell started one of the first and one of the longest running transgender support groups in the country. And she moved to Sandy Mush, North Carolina in 1976 and transitioned here and was one of the first individuals, women, to live as an out trans woman in Asheville. And sadly, Holly Boswell died in 2017, but many of the people in our archive talked about her. And so I wrote an article from the stories that other people had told about her and her work. She designed the transgender symbol that we use today still.
Wow.
So she was a real social justice warrior for trans rights, and she spent the bulk of her life here in Asheville.
That's so great. So awesome to hear that, or to know that different people's stories have contributed to that, that image of who Holly was. Wow, love it. Thanks for sharing that. That's great. So my next question is actually about the oral history project with Blue Ridge Pride. I know you've really helped us to understand the steps through this project, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking a little more about what you hope the project accomplishes, if there is a hope. Like I love how you talked about oral history. You just don't even know how they'll be used and understood in the future. Do you have any thoughts about this? Like why do this project? What is it? What could it contribute to beyond what you've already shared? Bless you. Which you've already shared some ways.
Yeah. Well, we started the project just really wanting to give people more access to LGBT voices in history. As we're moving into our second year with the project, my ambitions are changing a little bit. So, Buncombe County has more same-sex couples per capita than any other county in the state. And according to the census, last census, and yet like LGBT representation in K-12 curriculum is just pretty much non-existent, not just here, but just everywhere, in lots and lots of places. And there are some states who have been advocating for, more representation, LGBT representation in curriculum. And so that's kind of one thing that is a new goal. We've started creating K-12 like lessons that we've sent to the teachers. So one of them is about redlining and buying a house in Asheville. And it is to a lesbian couple who, weren't legally allowed to marry in the 80s, but they tell their story about trying to buy a house and some of the issues that they dealt with as it related to redlining. And so I think that's fascinating. Like, I think I want more to use the archive to build more of those K-12 lessons. But kind of like our big goals are to foster intergenerational conversation. Everybody that we've talked to that's an elder in the LGBT community here, whether they've lived here 5 years or 25 years, talks about feeling disconnected from the young people, the youth, all youth, or, but especially LGBT youth. And so that was something that was really important to me, was to partner elder interviewers with youth to be interviewed and vice versa, so that we have this intergenerational conversation, that we're at least cultivating a space for that, in the fact that we're pairing people by generation, across generations. Obviously, we want like a richer, a fuller, more inclusive history, LGBT history, to be accessible and available to people online. I want kids in every county in North Carolina to be able to click on their county and listen to people's stories that grew up there, that identify as LGBT. We are also, and this is really related to public health, this was something that our community partner, Blue Ridge Pride, really wanted us to pay attention to, was like what LGBT resources, events, those kinds of things are supporting LGBT communities here, and what do they need more of? So kind of like trying to do an asset map as well as a needs assessment around LGBT resources, nonprofits, and support work. we have so many nonprofit organizations devoted to all kinds of things, but LGBT organizations, it's just, the list is incredible. You can do gay men's yoga is one of them, right? Like there's just so many options. So it's nice now to be going through some of that data and looking in the oral histories to see what people are citing as this was really an important event in my journey, or when I did this, you know, worked with the Elder Advocates Network, you know, it really made me feel like I was part of something, so that we can, so that Blue Ridge Pride at least can know where to continue to you know, direct their time and their energies around what's working, you know.
Yeah, that's great. Wow, some really tangible and important, you know, products that can come, that are coming from this, and I think really contributing to better understanding and hopefully intention and action on the part of individuals as well. Yeah. So what you've been saying to me actually makes me think of two questions I didn't give you ahead of time. So thank you. One of the questions is related to the people themselves. You mentioned a little earlier that you know, sometimes people will say, I'm just amazed that you even want to talk with me or even listen to me for this time. And I wonder if you might be able to share a little bit about what you know to be or think to be the impact of oral history and telling their stories on the people who participate. You know, in research, we often think it's a burden, but this does not seem like a burden. If you wouldn't mind sharing some of that, I think
that's a great question. And this is really relevant to public health as well, because there's a lot of research that shows like palliative care, end of life care, that for individuals to be able to share and record their oral history is very good for their own sense of like feeling in control of their death and that time of their life. But also many people cite feeling really relieved that now their stories are available for their kids to listen to, so that maybe they won't forget things and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of research that talks about how the impact on the person who gets to tell their story, actually.
That's great. That's great. It is, again, another shift for us when we think about research, right?
Yeah, reciprocity, right? Like, so how many surveys have we done and we're just like, oh my gosh, again, another survey, right? Like you don't get some kind of like, we often don't even hear the conclusion from the survey, right? We don't get any real information from having given time to somebody else's research study. Whereas with oral history, it's reciprocal. It's happening in real time. You're building a real relationship with someone, you know? Absolutely. So because you asked that question, let me tell you another story.
Great.
So in 2016, when I did the oral history project around New Belgium's build site, when it was a brownfield, and we did all these interviews with people who had lived in West Asheville to just kind of ask about how that space had been used, you know, when it was the livestock market and all this other stuff. And we interviewed Albert Fortune. The Fortune building is the big red building, brick building in West Asheville. It has a sign on it, a plaque on it that says Fortune Building. And it was a hardware store. Albert Fortune, Mr. Fortune's dad was the hardware store owner. And it was the very last building on the trolley stop. And so all the kids got off the bus there and would come in and hang out in the hardware store and stuff. Mr. Fortune had so many stories. And so we transcribed his interview, and in the process of trying to make it available to him so he could read over it, he passed away. And so I packaged all that stuff up and shared it with his children. And so they were able to hear his voice again, you know, and get to hear him tell these stories. And she just wrote me such a beautiful note, his daughter, to say, you know, I hadn't even heard a lot of this stuff. And so I just like, how can you quantify that benefit, right? There, in terms of writing a grant, thinking about the outcomes of oral history, you know, that's one of them, but we don't know how to measure that, right? Really, or name it.
Right. And if we figured out a way would it really capture it as it is.
It's absolutely true, right?
Yeah, yeah, wow, what a story. And yeah, it makes me think we should be doing this. All of us should be doing this, capturing it all. Yeah, that's great. And the other sort of more impromptu question that came to mind was with the WNC LGBTQ plus oral history project. If the data are or will be available, that sounds so formal. If the oral histories will be available for other people to, like you said, your one of your goals is for somebody to be able to click and listen to one. What about if someone wanted to do secondary data analysis and wanted to learn more about the lives and maybe code some of the
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have 20 up right now. We have 60 interviews total. We have 20 up right now. I have another 28 that are ready, that are in different places of being synced or indexed online. But the 20 that are up, and they'll all eventually be up they're on the Special Collections website, and they're on Blue Ridge Pride's website as well. They're searchable. I mean, it's just like in a Google Doc. So you type in coming out and it'll give you 15 different people's coming out stories. Yeah, absolutely searchable. And that's what we want. I really would like a lot of people on campus to be using the archive, because I think there's a lot of information in there that doesn't even necessarily have to be about, coming out and LGBT identity, as much as it is trying to draw some information from a demographic that maybe we're not hearing in our other scholarship.
Good point. That's a really good point. It makes me think of the community health assessment that's conducted at a regional level. And I wonder if they're familiar, that'd be something that we could pass on to. We have the partners who are conducting that research. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to see if they know about it. That's great. Because it has the county that they're from, right? Because it is from this whole region as opposed to just Buncombe County.
Yeah, we mostly have focused on people who are from the South or have spent a period of their lives in the South. People who feel rooted here for whatever reason that is, whether they live here now or they lived here at some other point.
Oh, great. That's great. So I just have one more official question before I ask you if there's anything that you haven't had a chance to share that you might like to. And that is if a Master of Public Health student is interested in conducting oral history research, what would you recommend they consider or keep in mind as they kind of go off to think about or plan something like this?
One of the first things I have my students read is it's a selection out of the Oral History Reader, which is like an edited collection with lots of options. It's pretty expansive. It's a big fat book. But one of the selections in there is called Learning to Listen. And the authors are talking about not just how to like shut your mouth and listen, which is really challenging sometimes, right? Because that our human nature is when someone tells a story that relates to you, that you want to say, oh, that's like this thing in my life, right? And so you have to like resist the urge to share your story. We don't care about you, interviewer, right? It's about who you're interviewing. But it ultimately is also talking about how to learn to listen to your own bias and your own judgments. There are things that come up for us, habitual ways of thinking, that can interrupt our ability to listen to somebody else's story in an open way, right? Like, and so, I've heard it in interviews before when, for example, in one of our West Asheville interviews, somebody made a comment that wasn't, you wouldn't call it maybe racist. It didn't seem intentionally racist, I guess is what I mean to say, but it was offensive. And it was something I certainly wasn't going to publish or whatever. But in the moment, the student didn't know how to handle it, right? Didn't know what to do with that. And so then in a subsequent interview with that individual, the student was like, I want to go back to this thing that you said. And I wonder if you could explain to me what you meant, because when you said it, it caught me off guard. And so I didn't even feel comfortable talking to you about it. I moved right on to another question. And that was exactly what had happened. Some bias, or his bias flag flared, right? And he felt like he heard something and he couldn't unhear it. And then it changed the dynamic of the interview because of that. And so, that's I encourage everybody to read Learning to Listen. It says to listen in stereo, right? So listen for your own stuff, but keep it in there. Don't let it bias your interview process. And I would listen to some other interviews. It's one of the best ways to we think about oral history interviews are not hard. It simply is going in with a few questions and a willingness to learn from somebody. But it can feel nerve-wracking. I still get very nervous before I do interviews and things like that. So I think listening to somebody else's oral history interview is a good idea. I also think do an interview with a friend or somebody you already feel comfortable with first. So those are the strategies that's kind of how I model, like in my oral history for social change class. That's what I do. We read this Learning to Listen, they interview somebody that feels comfortable to them. Then we listen to some interviews, talk about strategies, like how do you get somebody to keep going, right? Like Ameena's clearly very good at doing interviews because you're nodding your head and being quiet and doing all those right things. But those things are important to learn. So that's what I say.
Those are terrific. Gosh, it does make me want to go out and try this now. So that's really exciting. And so important to remember the researcher's role and perspective. That's something that we've talked about in this class, and I think it's paramount throughout all research, but in this in particular, like you said, your relationship building and that self-awareness is critical. So I really, really appreciate that.
And too often we talk about that I'm writing up my data now, right? Writing about my data. And it's like at the end is where you start thinking about checking your researcher, privilege and stuff. But I think it's important all the way through.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Wow, this is so great. I really appreciate it. I do want to give you the opportunity, if there's anything else about oral history or oral history research that we didn't get to that you might like to share, if there is.
I'll say two things. One, I do think oral history is a radical methodology. I really do. I think that it is grassroots, it's grounded in the community. It is all about privileging individual voices and the complexity of reality, letting people self-represent. This is the other thing about some methodologies, is that we, the researcher, are still put in a position to represent the voice or the information or the data that we've come into, right? And with oral history, even when you're publishing oral history, it looks different because there's like big blocks of quotes, right? So your participants can speak for themselves as much as possible. So I would say it's radical. And I would also say that everybody should be doing this, that you literally should call your elders in your family tonight because you're not assured that tomorrow, and that you should call them and just exercise that privilege you have, which is to have someone to call and ask them, just ask them to talk about what's something that they would want you to remember about them, or what's a story that they haven't told you. I have a list of questions here. I'll read you some if that's helpful, like how to get started with your family. What mattered to you growing up? How is adulthood different than you imagined it would be? I love that question. It's always interesting responses. What do you think the next generation needs to know? Who's somebody who influenced you in your path in life? I think also in this country especially, we really need to be documenting real stories of racial integration. As a white woman who grew up in the South in a rural community, I can tell you that my parents did not talk about that I asked them about it in an effort for them to tell me their experiences. Horrific, horrific stories when they integrated the high school, and mostly African-American boys who were just terrorized for wanting to go to school. And I think that this is something that we need to be asking all of our elders. We need to have these stories, because I think there's so many more people not only not telling the real story, but there's so many more people saying it wasn't that bad. It's getting better. And we need some counter stories to that, I think. I just think we need to be talking to our elders. Every day is one fewer day to learn something from people. And the knowledge that they have is, I really just believe in ancient wisdom, and that our ancestors have a lot of the information that we need now, generations later, to combat some of the issues that we're still facing. So that's my soapbox.
Well, it is really great. I would say radical and rigorous and revolutionary even, and it makes research sound like it's much much bigger than just that one act of collecting some information, and isn't that what it's about? Yeah. So I can't imagine a better way to kick off our interviews with a researcher. So thank you so very much.
This was fun. Thank you so much, Ameena.
Yeah, my pleasure. Really appreciate it.